Good evening, everyone. My name is Andre Zolden, and I want to thank you for joining us for this special ADATH event. Everyone has a story, a virtual monthly lecture series to get to know some of our ADATH members on a more familiar level. This evening, we are putting our dear member, Sid Milech, under the microscope. Yes, we will discover the known and not so well-known facts and events of his life and career, which I'm sure will be enlightening, enjoyable, and hopefully not too embarrassing. Thank you all for participating in this event and for your support and donations. I'd like to remind everyone that our next speaker will be on Sunday, May 2nd at 8 p.m., where we will have Solly Zuckerman, entrepreneur extraordinaire. I invite all of you to join us, and please bring your friends. Now I would like to introduce Morris Swimmer, a longtime BFF, best friend forever, of Sid, who will be conducting the interview. Please type your questions into the chat box, and Morris will conduct a Q&A at the end of the evening. Morris is a partner at Spiegel Summer, specializing in mergers and acquisitions, or in the Jewish world, we call them ashatchen, but with big bucks. Now, without further delay, I give you Morris Swimmer. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to the ADATH Israel virtual speaker series, where tonight we'll hear from, as you've heard, our special guest speaker, Sid Milech, as he tells us his story about his journey from a child of survivors to a Jewish community leader. I'd like to thank all of you from all over the world for registering for this event, and for those who took the opportunity to contribute to the ADATH in honor of Sid. As you know now know, my name is Morris Swimmer, and I'd like to thank the ADATH and its board for giving me the opportunity to introduce Sid tonight. Although this is not about me, which Sid explained when I questioned him as to why I didn't get top billing on the shul advertisement for tonight's event, I suppose I'll start my introductions by saying that other than my late father Shlomo, a blessed memory, I never really had a mentor in my life. But that changed a little over 20 years ago. Sid and I met at the White Country Camp during the summer of 2000, where he was serving as camp director, and I had the greatest job I ever had, the camp doctor's husband, or the person that everybody completely ignored. During that time, I got to observe what an amazing leader, teacher, and role model Sid was to over 400 campers, and of course, the young staff he hired and oversaw. Sid would work tirelessly from 5 a.m. in the morning to well into the late night and next morning, ensuring that the campers and staff were safe, well-fed, engaged, and always involved in fun and meaningful activities. I would often try to speak to him during my first years in the camp, having loved camp myself, but rarely did he have time for my suggestions about how to run the camp. When I did have a moment to speak to him and convey my input, he would often say, "That's really great. Good idea, Morris, but let me run the camp and let me take care of it." But things changed with our relationship in 2006 and 2007, when both Sid and I found ourselves together, not only as chaperones on the March of the Living for our teenage participants, but also as roommates. Rooming with Sid is an experience I'll really never forget, no matter how hard I try. It was bad enough that he was always sloppy, snored, and kept me up at night. But I was amazed that this educator, principal, and camp director was never on time and usually overslept. This resulted in our often ending up waking up late and chasing the bus in the morning to avoid being left behind in some Polish shtetl. What I did observe, though, firsthand was his remarkable ability to connect with the young adults who were drawn to him night and day at all hours to talk about the day's events, what we had seen, and how that would connect to their own journeys as future Jewish leaders. As a secular Jew myself, I remember every moment of the Shabbat I spent with Sid on a kibbutz in Israel during the second half of our journey on the march. It started actually with a fight. Sid insisted that I give him my BlackBerry at the time. He told, before Shabbat started, he told me that he was doing this not for him, not for the kids, although he insisted that I set a good example, but for me. And I then spent Kabbalat Shabbat services with him and Saturday and the rest of Shabbat together with Sid, relaxing. It was in the afternoon, that instead of kibitzing with me as we overlooked the sea, that all of a sudden he sprung up and pointed to a group of kids that were just sitting around doing nothing. He asked me if I would join him as he wanted to talk to them. I said, Sid, leave them alone. They're relaxing. They're doing whatever they do. Just leave them alone. He said no. He approached them, started by talking and joking with the group, and then began telling stories of his family, the Holocaust, Israel, Shabbat, and the importance of their own place and leadership role in the community. Completely off the cuff, the group grew from 5 kids to 25 to 50 kids, all listening intently and respectfully, and quite frankly, eating out of Sid's hand. It was remarkable. What I learned about Sid is his greatest joy is to be a role model and mentor, leading by an amazing example. Together with his wife, Elaine, what I like to call the Jewish community power couple of our city, they have led, taught, and inspired an entire generation of Jewish leaders in Montreal. Of course, they have also managed to make time in the process to raise 3 wonderful children and now concentrate on shepping nachas from their handsome grandson. Sid is kind, considerate, not as funny as he thinks, but thoughtful and incredibly passionate about Judaism and the community. I can honestly say, I really don't know a better mensch than Sid. So now I'll let you be inspired. And perhaps although you've just eaten, it'll be your turn to have some dessert and eat out of Sid's hands a little, albeit virtually. So it's my great pleasure to present a great man, a loving husband, father, Zeta, brother, uncle, and of course, my friend and mentor, Sid Milech. Sid, floor is yours.
Well, I think that's a tough act to follow. Thank you so much, Morris. And I'm just a little disappointed. I don't think I'm as funny as I thought I was. Anyways, before we start, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Alvin, Andre, Rabbi Whitman, the entire DAF team, Stu, for organizing this wonderful speaker series, which has really been incredible and will continue to grow. And especially for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my family and my journey, my interesting journey. So I was born in Montreal in 1950. And being born in 1950 actually makes figuring out how old I am very easy. In fact, I remember when my son Michael was 9 years old and my daughters Karina and Daya were 4 and 6 years old. We were sitting around the dinner table one night and I was talking to them about how to calculate my age. I said that since I was born in 1950, in 1960, I was 10. And in 1970, I was 20. So Michael, who was, I guess, in grade 3 or 4, I said, Michael, how old was I in 1980? And he said, 30. A very smart kid, and his mother's a math teacher. I said, great. How about 1990? And he said, 40. I said, fantastic. Okay. How old will I be in the year 2000? And he said, he thought for a minute and he said, 50. I said, that's fantastic. And my last question is, how old will I be in the year 2050? And my 6-year-old daughter, Dahlia, had been listening quietly to all of this, said, dead. That's what she said. So according to her calculations, I only have about 29 years left. So I think I better get on with this presentation because I'm running out of time. Anyways, as I said, I was born in 1950, along with my twin brother, Harvey. And Stu, I think there's a picture that you're supposed to put up now. This is actually a picture taken, I think it was in 1952. And that's my parents, my brother. I'm the serious, upset looking guy on the right of your screen. He's the good looking, cute kid on the left under sitting on my father's lap. And that's my sister, Blima. And as I mentioned, Blima is watching tonight from Toronto. She was actually born in 1948, just a few months before the state of Israel was set up in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And She's watching tonight. She has one beautiful kids, two fantastic sons-in-law, and four beautiful grandchildren. And also, to add insult to injury, it was her birthday yesterday. So, Blima, happy birthday. Great to see you here. I consider us, this family, we children, a miracle children. And the reason is because it's hard to picture this, but 6 years before this picture were taken, both of my parents were in Poland fighting to stay alive in the midst of the Shoah. I have only one picture of my father's family taken in the town of Parchev, which is near Lublin, in the mid-1930s. And if we can see the pictures too. So that's the picture of my father's family. My father is the guy on the top left, and in the top right is my uncle Moshe, who eventually made Aliyah to Israel. And my uncle David is a little kid sitting on my grandfather's lap. Those are my grandparents. And the two girls are my aunts, Bella and Esther. Unfortunately, my grandparents and my two aunts were murdered by the Nazis while hiding out in the forest in a partisan family camp. My dad and his two brothers survived 4 grueling winters in the forest as partisans, bombing German trains and ambushing Nazi soldiers. There was a movie that was made that many of you may have seen called Defiance, which was made about the story of the Bielski brothers, who actually lived through the war in a partisan family camp not far from my father. And when I watched the film with him, he actually told me it was pretty accurate. What he remembered most was the cold, the hunger, and of course the fact that most of his family was murdered. To this day, those two girls in the picture, my aunts, live on in spirit, as my uncle Moshe named his two of his daughters, Esther and Bella. And they are still my very close cousins who live in Israel, with, thank God, too many grandchildren for me able to keep track of. And in fact, one of the grandchildren is old enough to become a paratrooper in the Israeli forces last year. My mother, Esther, was separated from her parents, sisters, and brothers after the war broke out. The only picture I have from her family before the war is this one of my grandmother. My grandfather had died of cancer several years before the war, and my grandmother, this woman, was murdered in Treblinka. My mother's brothers and one sister had been living in France, and 2 of them, Charles and Ephraim, and all of their little children were murdered in Auschwitz by the Nazis. My mother, who at one point in her experience jumped from a moving train with a friend, eventually ended up first at Majdanek and then at Auschwitz, and was finally miraculously saved near the end of the war by a Soviet Jewish soldier who saved her from some of the other Soviet soldiers. After the war, my parents, who were distant cousins, met up again and got married. And here's a picture of the 2 lovebirds. There they are. And in 1949, they joined my dad's younger brother, David, in Canada. This was just after they got married. My parents are the ones who deserve all the credit for my personal journey of involvement with the Jewish community. They spoke to us in Yiddish growing up, raised us in a traditional Jewish home, and in spite of the financial hardships, made sure that we all had a formal Jewish education. Of course, in those days, since my sister was a girl, she only got to go to afternoon school and Sunday school. But my brother Harvey and I were sent to the Adath on Ducharme Street. So my introduction to the Adath goes back a few years when I was 7 years old. And if you could figure out when I was born in 1950, that's right, Brenda, 1957. One of the special memories that exemplifies my parents' commitment to Judaism was that even though it was hard for them to afford it, my parents were the ones who every year organized the family Seder for the whole family in our house. And in so many other ways, they really built a strong and meaningful foundation of Yiddishkeit, which was passed on to their children, grandchildren, and now to their great-grandchildren. In the film Fiddler on the Roof, the song Tradition talks about the role of the mother as the one who keeps a proper home, a kosher home, must raise a family and runs the home, and so on. And this describes my mother, Esther, perfectly. One of the other things that my mother and father passed on to us children was a love and appreciation of life. In all the photos of my mother, you'll notice that she has a beautiful smile, and she shared that smile with everyone who was lucky enough to get to know her. And you can see an example of this in this photo taken at my brother Harvey's and my bar mitzvah. This is from our bar mitzvah album, which was not in color, black and white. And there we are. And the interesting thing is that the guy who actually made the drasha, gave the drasha at our bar mitzvah, which was at the Adath, was Rabbi Bender, who to us little kids was a very scary guy. And I got to tell you, much scarier than Rabbi Whitman. Sadly, my beautiful brother Harvey passed away about 6 years ago. He was a really special, unique guy who always saw the best in everybody. And he passed on that trait to his daughter, Leanne, who's now a professor of English in Toronto. Let me tell you a little bit about my father. He was the type of guy who made friends with everyone, which of course was always a source of embarrassment to me and my siblings. It could be a security bank at the Guard, a cashier at Steinberg's, for those of you who remember what Steinberg's was, or the rest of the free world. He was a taxi driver, and he would come home with all kinds of stories about all the people that he met and all the people he befriended, including Jean Beliveau and Harry Belafonte. And he told us one of those guys was a great tipper, and the other guy didn't tip at all. But I'm not going to tell you which is which. You'll have to figure it out, but I can speak to you later on if you really want to know. Anyways, after my mother passed away in the year 2000, I traveled to Israel with my father several times for family weddings. And here's a typical picture of my father. He had approached these two young Israeli soldiers near the Kotel and immediately started regaling to them stories about himself as a partisan in World War II. While I stood there cringing, the soldiers were mesmerized and fell in love with him. And you can see one of them is wearing my father's cap, and he's actually trying on the soldier's beret. Never a dull moment with him. As a final footnote, my kids tell me today, Daddy, you're just like a Zeta of Rum. And I must admit, I have managed to befriend every Uber driver I've ever met. One thing, though, that I'm a bit embarrassed to admit is that as I became a teenager, I was sometimes, like many teenagers, embarrassed by my parents, and especially by their accent, European accent. And I remember even arguing with them about the uselessness of Yiddish and the need to replace it, that everybody should be speaking Hebrew and forget about Yiddish. My edification on this issue took an interesting turn a few years later, and I'll share that with you in a few minutes. Meanwhile, one of the life-changing events I experienced as a teenager was that I got involved with an organization called NCSY, a youth group, a Jewish youth group that gave me the opportunity to meet kids my age. We had bowling parties, beach parties, trips to other NCSY cities, and of course meet girls, and once in a while the odd Jewish program. In fact, it was after I attended an NCSY teen convention in the Catskills that I became Shomer Shabbat at the age of 15. At Sir George Williams University, remember that, I majored in political science and international affairs. And it was there that I came across the writings of Elie Wiesel. Aside from his powerful book, Night, and some of the other books that he wrote about the Holocaust, the book that really struck me was a book by the name entitled The Jews of Silence. This was in 1971, and he was writing about Soviet Jews. And he talked about the importance, especially with his history, his background of the Shoah, the importance of people in, especially North America, doing whatever we can to help the Jews in the Soviet Union. It was then that I decided to travel to the Soviet Union. My friend Bernie and I had already planned to do what a lot of kids did when we graduated school. We would travel to Europe and then go to a kibbutz for a year. And when I mentioned it to him, he was fine with it. Of course, my parents were not fine with it. They were not excited about the fact that I would not only go to the Soviet Union, which in 1971 was a bit of a crazy thing to do, but also travel through Poland. Nonetheless, after a lot of tears and arguing, we convinced them that we were going, and we went to the Soviet consulate in Montreal after a few weeks, and we managed to get our visas. Eventually, September of 1971, we were off to Europe. Our first stop was actually in Paris, where I stayed with my uncle Emile, my mother's only surviving brother. one evening, Bernie and I decided we'd go to the Champs-Élysées and hang out and we went for a beer, a coffee. We did some sightseeing, had a great time. The lights were magnificent. It was a beautiful place. And then we decided it was time to get back. It was about 1 o'clock, just after 1. So we walked back to the metro, and then we found, to our chagrin, that guess what? At that time, the metro stopped running at 1 o'clock. Well, this was 10 after 1. What do we do? My uncle lived on the other side of Paris, but we knew we'd have to catch a taxi. So we went back to the Champs-Élysées, which was very busy at this time. I guess, I don't know, people were coming out of the theater or opera or restaurants, whatever. And everybody was very elegantly dressed. They were wearing, like, the women were in furs and the men were fancy suits and whatever. And then Bernie and I looked like these two long-haired hippies. And I think there's a picture, Stu, that you could show just to give you an idea of what I looked like at the time. So I know it's hard to believe, but that's actually me a few weeks later on the kibbutz in Israel. It was taken by a photographer called Bruno, an Italian photographer. So you could understand possibly why no taxi would stop for us. They would go right by us, pick up other people, and just leave us standing there. We were there for about 40 minutes and no taxi would stop for us. We were desperate. All of a sudden, right beside us, there was this elegant couple, an elderly elegant couple, trying to catch a taxi. And they were speaking in Yiddish. I said, aha. I was totally desperate. I walked over to them and I said, and I hope with apologies to the DAF Yiddish group, I said to them, excusez-moi, ich bin a Yid von Montreal, Canada. Ich stehe bei mein Onkel Emile auf the Boulevard Saint-Martin and kannst mir helpen, happen a taxi. Now, roughly translated, that's help. You know, I'm Jewish and I need help. Can you help us catch a taxi? Well, they were shocked, either by the way we look, probably obviously by the way we look, but also by my broken Yiddish. And they said, of course. They took us in the cab. They got a cab right away. They took us with them, drove us right to my uncle's house, which was out of the way of where they were going, refused to take money, and kissed us. The woman kissed us when we left the taxi. And that was really incredible, only because we were fellow Jews. And that actually was my introduction to the concept of Jewish peoplehood, that Judaism was not just a religion. And the religion is very important, obviously, but it's not just religion. It's also a family where we're bonded together, no matter where we come from, what we look like, what other languages we speak. We're all one family. And that was really very special. And of course, I was so grateful and appreciative of the fact that my parents had taught me Yiddish, even though I was a lousy student. A few days later, we made it to Poland, where we actually stayed at the Bristol Hotel, which I found out later was where Hitler stayed when he was in Warsaw in World War II. And then we went on to Prague, where over Yom Kippur, we davened at the Altnai Shul, which is the oldest synagogue in Europe, the oldest functioning synagogue in Europe in the old city of Prague. Finally, on to Russia. I have to tell you, some of my experiences in Russia, and we were there for over a week, are the subject of a whole other evening, and included eating at a sukkah attached to the synagogue in Leningrad, getting a little tipsy with a bunch of happy, friendly, drunken, crazy Russians on the train, and also watching the changing of the guard at Lenin's tomb in Red Square at midnight. I will share one story that influenced my life in a very positive way. One of the people we met while dancing with thousands of fellow Jews in front of the great synagogue in Moscow on Simchas Torah was this guy called Lev. He was a young man who actually his real job, his official job, was writing marching songs for the Soviet army. But what he did on the side was write anti-Soviet poetry for himself and for his friends. And after we got to know him for a couple of days, and which also was pretty fascinating, he whispered to us one evening as we were all standing with thousands of other people. He asked us if we would do him a favor, but it was a little bit dangerous. He asked us if we would take his name and address and bring it to Israel. The reason for this is that at that time, it was just the beginning of Russia, the Soviet Union allowing a small number of Jews to immigrate to Israel, but only if they had family there. Now, many of them didn't have family there. So what they did is they had to try and find a way to get their names and information to Israel, and then Israel would set up a fake family for them. Lev told me it was somewhat dangerous. He pointed out that Bernie and I were actually being followed by the KGB, which of course blew my mind. And sure enough, actually, it was very easy to see because they weren't hiding. I mean, we would walk and two guys would follow us. We'd cross the street, they'd cross the street with us. So he said, here's what we're going to do. I said, you know what? After reading the book about Elie Wiesel, I said, and we were also two stupid young Canadians who thought we were infallible. We said, of course we'll help you. Of course we'll do this. Little did we know what could possibly happen. He said, okay. We went for a walk and we walked into a bakery and he whispered in my ear, he said, I'm just going to put something in your pocket. Don't pay attention. But tonight, when you get back to your hotel, I want you to take the paper and take it out of your pocket and put it in your wallet. Just hide it among some papers or pictures in your wallet. So that's what I did. Later on, I was back at the hotel. I went into the bathroom. I shut the light. I was so paranoid about, Soviet agents and cameras and everything. Took out the piece of paper, saw his name and address, and put it in my wallet. A few days later, we were leaving Russia. When our train stopped at the Romanian-Russian border, train stopped and customs control. We were told there was going to be customs control, get your passport out. Got our passport out and two soldiers came into our little cabin on the train. And one of them grabbed our suitcases, opened our suitcases, turned them upside down and went through all of our stuff on the bed. The other one took Bernie's wallet, asked for Bernie's wallet, opened up the wallet, took out every piece of paper, his picture, his license, whatever money was there. To say that I was a little scared at this time is to put it mildly. All of a sudden, while this is going on, we hear this loud screaming going on outside and whistles. All of a sudden, the two soldiers left our cabin and went out. It turns out, we found out later from other Romanians on the train, that some Romanians had tried to smuggle gold from Russia into Romania, which was a big no-no. The soldiers never came back into our compartment. In a few minutes, the train began to move, and Bernie, my wallet, Lev's papers, and I were safe in Romania. Weeks later, a few days after arriving in Israel, we dropped off Lev's information at the Ministry of Absorption and Immigration. I spent about a year in Israel, mostly working on a kibbutz called Mashabei Sadeh, which is near Beersheba. And I've been fortunate to visit Israel about a dozen times since then. My most recent visit was actually last February. And how lucky was it? We were there just before the pandemic. Morris is smiling because he knew about this. My wife, Elaine, had arranged for my 70th birthday party a surprise in Israel. And everybody, Morris' friends, they made a video. Everybody knew about this except me. When we arrived in Jerusalem on the first day that we were there, I turned around the corner to get to the restaurant, and standing there were my three kids, my son-in-law, and my 4-year-old grandson. The fact that I didn't have a heart attack was a miracle. Well, they say there's lots of miracles in Israel. Anyway, she had organized this for 4 months, worked everything out, the hotels, flights, spent tons of money. God bless her. Anyways, but it was incredible. A week later, something else happened. The party continued. Elaine and my cousins had arranged another surprise party with most, not all, because they all couldn't come, but most of my Israeli family in attendance. In fact, here's a picture we took that night at that party. So the incredible thing about this is that of these people, it all started with one person, my uncle Moshe, who was that partisan in the war with my father. And he immigrated to Israel. He made Aliyah. He had 3 daughters. They're religious. They have tons of kids, tons of grandchildren. And this was the family. And they keep growing all the time. Really a fantastic miracle. Meanwhile, back to the year 1972. When I returned to Montreal after my year in Israel, I decided to go into education, and I got a master's degree in educational studies. After I graduated, I got a job at Bialik High School as a teacher of Jewish history, Jewish literature, and Jewish traditions. The highlight for me at Bialik was, in fact, that's where I met my wife, Elaine. And in fact, I was one of the only religious Jewish teachers at Bialik. The other one was Elaine. And I have to tell you, some of my students were pretty shocked that you could be religious and relatively normal. And I know, Morris, you find it strange that I'm relatively normal, but relatively normal in that I actually at the time also, aside from teaching at Bialik, I was the founding director of Redwood Country Day Camp. So they were really stunned. You play football, you run a camp, and you're religious. It's crazy. It's amazing. So that was a really interesting experience for them and for me. I have to tell you, though, that one day I was walking through the halls at Bialik, and on one of the lockers, there was a little inscription that said, and I'm going to cut it. I'm not going to say exactly what it said. I'll just say it said, F. Sid Milech. You could figure out what the rest of the word was. So I guess, nobody's perfect. And I guess not everybody liked me the way Morris loves me. I will tell you something else, though. I mentioned I was the director of Redwood Country Day Camp, but actually my first job was at a camp called Green Acres. I don't know if some of you remember that camp. And I remember to this day being interviewed by the program director at the camp, who's a young a dental student. And his name, you'd be surprised, was Peter Safran. And he was a very tough negotiator, because I remember he started off offering me $25 for the summer, but I held out until I managed to get $50 out of him for the whole summer, which I guess in those days was a lot of money. Anyways, from what I'm told by his wife, Miriam, Peter's still a tough negotiator today. Getting back to Bialik High School, here's a picture of me talking to my students teaching. This is more or less what I looked like as a teacher. I was either talking to them about Shalom Aleichem or the Holocaust, or probably I was talking to them about my kids, because I used to brag about my kids all the time. One of my responsibilities at Bialik was getting my students involved in community volunteer work. I remember handing out postcards that we would send. I had them fill out, and we were going to send them to Anatoly Sharansky. And if you remember, he was a refusnik prisoner of the Soviet Union at the time. And my students asked me, they said, did I really think Sharansky was going to get our postcards? Would it really make a difference? The truth of the matter is, I didn't think it would make a difference. I didn't think he would get the cards, but of course I was their teacher. So I said, I'm sure he'll get the cards. It's important for us to write them. Years later, in one of his books, Never Alone, Natan Sharansky, as he was now called, wrote that though he was never allowed to receive mail when he was in prison, through the prison grapevine, he had heard that people were sending him millions of letters. There were hundreds and thousands of demonstrations to get him out. And that was one of the things that always kept him hopeful. And it was a powerful lesson that I learned. Never underestimate how even the most obscure effort, an act of kindness, can change the world for somebody. After several years as a teacher at Bialik and later as principal of JPPS on Van Horn, hi Goldie, Goldie was my secretary, I became the director of the Y Country camp, where I ended up for over 20 years, as Morris had mentioned. YCC was a Jewish camp, but none of the kids were religious, or very few of them were religious. So I saw this as a unique opportunity to introduce some Jewish traditions, some beautiful Jewish traditions in the camp. But I had to be really careful not to turn the kids off, and even more serious, not to scare off my board of directors. One of the programs that I eventually introduced became a new Saturday night tradition at YCC, Havdalah. I know it's hard for us to believe this, but at that time, very few children and campers and counselors had participated in Havdalah. So what it meant was I had to run from one unit to another. And YCC is a big camp, to go from one unit near the lake, another one in the forest, to run Havdalah. The nice thing is that after a couple of years, I trained a whole generation of campers and counselors who would do this without me. That's what you call nachas. There's a great story that I once heard about a little girl who was crying on the last day of camp. And counselor came over to her and said, "Why are you crying? You're sad, camp's over." He says, "Well, I'm really crying because I won't be able to participate in Havdalah. It's my favorite program." So the counselor said, "What do you mean?" I'll just write out what to do and I'll send it with you to your parents and they'll be able to do it at home. He says, no, we can't do Havdalah at our home. We don't live near a lake. Anyways, as we all know, the magic of Havdalah can work even without a lake. Although I have to admit, with the lake and the stars, it's really special. Another great memory I have at YCC is that I introduced Saturday morning services, and I made them short and sweet, which personally I think all Saturday services should be short and sweet. Aside from Adon Olam and En Kelohenu and a little parsha of the week, one of the things that I introduced was something called a kotel moment. Remember the commercial? It used to be a commercial, a Kodak moment. So this was a kotel moment where every week a few campers and a few counselors would volunteer to talk for a few minutes about some meaningful Jewish memory or experience they had. And I always remember this little 8-year-old girl who stood up in front of the whole camp and very shyly said, I love Shabbat because every Friday night our whole family gets together at my grandmother's house and we have lasagna. I know, not like the chicken soup my mother made or the chicken soup that I make with matzo balls, but for her, this was a meaningful Shabbat experience, which was really pretty beautiful. One summer at the Wise Open House, I was approached at the office by a mother and her 12-year-old daughter. The daughter had some cognitive and some physical disabilities. She'd been attending another sleepaway camp, but when she turned 12, the other director said that their camp could no longer accommodate her, and he suggested she check out YCC. After listening to her story, I told her that we couldn't accept her daughter because we're not geared to deal with campers with special needs. And I apologized, but I said, we're really full, we're a big camp, and we're just not prepared to do this. She left my office and I watched her leave. She had a sad look on her face. She was walking away, holding her daughter's hand, and her daughter was very quiet. And I thought to myself, just a second, you're the director of this huge camp. You're the Groise Balabus. You're in charge of everything. You make decisions about everything, about Havdalah, about what we eat, about the caterer, about the bus companies we use. And you're acting like a heartless bureaucrat. This makes no sense. I got up, I chased after them as they were just getting into the car at the parking lot. And I said, just a second, I don't know how we'll do this, but we're going to make it happen. That girl, a beautiful girl, was a camper at YCC for 6 years. And she was even a counselor for 1 year, a staff person in our kitchen for 1 year. And I'm still friends with them to this very day. And I know that we talk about camp. She always says those were some of the best summers of her life. And for me, that experience was life-changing. It opened up a whole new world that I was completely oblivious to before. It was totally life-changing. And it was then that I founded something called Camp Tikva, the YCC Special Needs Family Camp. What this was, and it's still running today, is that after a regular camp was over, we opened up the camp to families with children with special needs. And they would come up to the camp for 5 days. And there's nobody else there, just these families with our counselors. And for them, for these children, it was the first time for most of them that they were able to experience a summer camp experience. Canoeing, a lot of them had never done canoeing, rock climbing, sitting around a campfire, singing songs and eating marshmallows. It was so special. And I'll always remember we took the kids horseback riding at a place near our camp, and there was a young boy who was partially blind and physically disabled. And as he got up on the horse and he started moving around the circle with the horse, the ring with the horse on a horse, his beautiful smile just epitomized the incredible pride and joy that he was feeling. And his parents and I stood there in tears. But camp was also special for these parents in other ways. In the evenings, after the parents had put their kids to sleep and then the counselors took over and supervised, the parents had free time to spend together. And I remember that first year we did the camp, they came to my house, and we had a rabbi in residence. That year it was Rabbi Shire of the Shar Shemayim. And he took out a bottle of scotch And we told stories and jokes. And some of the parents, some of whom were single parents, said it's the first time in years they've been able to spend a relaxing evening together with other adults without worrying about their children. I have to say that a few years later, our own Rabbi Whitman was actually the rabbi in residence at Camp Tikva. And a few weeks ago, I asked him about his experience, and he said it was incredible. The staff was amazing. The kids were beautiful. They were fantastic. He said the only problem was there were too many mosquitoes. Well, Rabbi, with all due respect, this is the Laurentians, not Memphis. You know, we have mosquitoes. But I have to tell you, they had an amazing experience. And Marcy and Rabbi Whitman were really a very special addition to the camp and did an amazing job. There's a saying that many of you are familiar with, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Following one commandment leads to another commandment. And my involvement with the Camp Tikva introduced me to all kinds of incredible people in the world of special needs. And two of those people are Harriet Miller and Helene Lieberman Donut. The two of these ladies, very special people, founded something called the A-Link Foundation. A-Link is a parent-run organization that works with other organizations to co-create a community that embraces people of all abilities, including those with intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorders. I'm honored to be on the board of A-Link, and I'm also very proud that Rabbi Whitman and the Adath has been major collaborators and supporters of A-Link. In fact, you know those delicious cookies and cakes you have at the Shabbat Kiddush at the shul on Saturdays? Those are made in the Adath kitchen by the members of the A-Link Cooking for Kiddush program. And they keep asking me all the time, when are we going to be able to start again? So we will in the near future. And it's also a highlight of my week every Sunday afternoon that I lead a Zoom storytelling session to young adults with special needs, neurodiverse young adults. This is a program that's open to everyone. I did it earlier today. And if you know of any young adult who might be interested in this, the more the merrier. It's like a half-an-hour program, and we talk a lot about everything, and I tell a little story with a cute message. And sometimes it's even funny, Morris. Well, I think it's funny. I don't know.
You try.
One of the exciting programs, just to finish with A-Link, is something called, we're working on a new project setting up a respite center for the weekends called Le Bayit. And this will be a fantastic break, a well-deserved break for the parents, but it'll also be a training center for these young adults so that they'll become more independent when they move out on their own. So we're in the funding stages right now, and we're really excited about setting that up. I mentioned earlier about my close connection with Israel. So when Amos Sochachevsky called and asked me to be on the March to Jerusalem committee, how could I refuse him? Of course, if you know Amos, he didn't stop then. Not long after we became friends, he introduced me to Beit HaLachem, the organization in Israel that offers services and support to wounded Israeli soldiers. One of the programs at Beit HaLachem is an annual 2-week vacation that they arrange for veterans, for 10 veterans every year, to go to different cities throughout the world and to Montreal as well. A few years ago, Elaine and I hosted a vet at our house. I'm sure some of you have done this, and you know what a special experience this is. It's like adopting a new member to your family. For 2 weeks, we hosted the vet while the Montreal Beit HaLachem Trip Committee, of which I'm now the co-chair, thank you very much, Amos, takes them on a variety of excursions in and around Montreal, where they are treated like royalty and the heroes that they really are. Elaine and I were blessed with this guy, Nir, a young man in his mid-30s who had been an officer in the IDF for 12 years, but who now suffered severely from PTSD. At the closing banquet, Nir shared a message that I will always remember. He said that when he was an officer, one of his responsibilities was training the new recruits. And part of his job was to tell them that when they're fighting, they should realize that they're not just fighting for themselves and their fellow soldiers and their families and for Israel, but they're fighting for Jews throughout the whole world. Now, he said this to them, but he didn't really believe it. He had never met really Jews from the diaspora. He'd never been in the diaspora, but he did it because that's what he was told to say. He now said that after spending 2 weeks in Montreal, staying at our house and being so warmly welcomed by the Montreal Jewish community, he now really does believe what he had taught his soldiers. In fact, a special highlight of our trip to Israel last year was that we visited Nir in Pardes Chana, and I think there's a picture here, yeah. So that's Nir in the middle, the good-looking guy next to his wife and his 3 children, and there's Elena, myself, and my brother-in-law and my Israeli sister-in-law. And I tell you, it was really like being reunited with a family member, and we're in touch all of the time. Beit HaLochem, like other organizations, is having a tough time because of the pandemic. Like we couldn't have our gala this year, we couldn't bring the vets over. And so we are now in the midst of a special fundraising campaign called Tikva. And I'll be happy to send anyone a link and tell you more about it so you can be involved in supporting these modern day Maccabees. I'd like to talk briefly about my participation with March of the Living that Morris talked about just before. I was honored to be invited as a chaperone one year and as an educator on another year, 2001 and 2007. But I'm especially proud of the fact, and Morris, you didn't mention this, that I was the first chaperone to bring the football on these trips. That has now become an absolute necessity. It's amazing how easy it is to start a new tradition. I remember we stopped at a gas station in Poland. We're throwing around a football and people are looking at us a little bit strange. Anyways, here's a picture that I wanted to share. Stu, are you still there? There we are. So here's a picture actually of Morris and myself, our tonight's moderator, taken at a cemetery in Poland. And there's so many stories we could share about that experience, that trip. Morris, like me, is a child of survivors, and Morris actually went on to become a very popular and influential chairman of the March trip in 2010. And his kids that meet up with him still talk about what an influence he was on their lives. I'd like to share with you just a short story about something that happened, a very scary story that happened to us on the march, but this was in Israel. It was Yom HaZikaron, and we were at a cemetery, a military cemetery in Beersheba. And I was just doing a head count, making sure we have everybody, when all of a sudden, I realized we're missing somebody. We're short a student. This was crazy. There had been some unrest with the Bedouin and with the Arabs, and this was crazy. I spoke to the leader. I spoke to our security guy. We started doing a manhunt. Where is this kid? Where could he be? What could have happened to him? And all of a sudden, my cell phone rings. I pick up the phone. I said, yes. And a voice on the other end, it's the missing student, says, hey, Sid, what's going on? Where is everybody? I said, what? Where are you? What's the matter with you? Are you crazy? Anyways, a few minutes later, we found him, got together, and I ripped into him. Because how could you possibly wander off on your own? We had told you not to do this. Anyways, I ripped into him, but I have to say, I wound up hiring him at YCC. Not because he was clued out and got lost, which he was and is, but because of how calmly he handled it. And as a counselor, it's very important to be calm. Now, I don't think you'll be very shocked to know that this student is sitting right here, and his name is Stu Gutman. Way to go, Stu. So when Stu sometimes on these Zoom calls is not there, or he forgets, or his children, or whatever, some excuse, don't be shocked and don't be upset, because after all, what would we do without him? We all love you, Stu. And my journey never ends, as I'm now on the board of the ADAF. And in fact, I just joined our outreach committee. After all, how could I say no to Peter Safford? I told you, he's a very tough negotiator. I'm coming to the end now. I started this presentation talking about my incredible 3 children. And I'm so proud that they are living the values that they inherited from their grandparents. These are my 4 children. On the left is my son, Michael, who actually works in the Prime Minister's office as a senior policy advisor in justice and other areas. Hugging him is my daughter, Karina, who actually teaches cardio dance to neurodiverse children and young adults. My son-in-law, Jonathan, works for Public Security Canada in cybersecurity. And my daughter Dahlia is actually the director of the Ottawa Kosher Food Bank. And aside from, this this Tikkun Olam stuff that they do, they also happen to be really nice people, and we're so proud of them. There's a famous saying: more than the Jewish people have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jewish people. And I can honestly say that more than I have done for the Jewish community has done for me. I know that all of you participating tonight are people who contribute in so many important ways, not only to the welfare of the Jewish community, but like Lawrence and other people, to the community at large. And we all understand how our volunteer work not only makes the world a better place, but also serves to make us as individuals better human beings. And I'd like to end tonight with the words of Herman Taub, a wonderful poet and Holocaust survivor who spent the last years of his life in Baltimore, Maryland. And his poetry is praised by Elie Wiesel, is a perfect tribute to the values my parents taught us. These are the last 4 stanzas of his poem entitled Life. Only when we learn to share our joy and love with others does life become beautiful. I discovered the essential facts of life when my days turned to night. I chose to fight for light. Family, friends, and fellowship, the joys of writing and reading became my absolute inspiration. Every day, I have a rendezvous with myself, planning how I will best live this day. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Absolutely amazing to say. Really, really inspiring. I got to say, what an amazing journey, and your passion for the community is certainly contagious. Your singing, not so sure you should have done that. But anyways, we'll leave that for another time. Stu, do you want to field some questions? You want me to field some questions? How do you want to handle this?
Just take a look at the thread, and we've got one.
So I will say that on the thread, it's been mostly beautiful comments about how you and Elaine have inspired students, now adults, as teachers, and participants on the March of Living, people that worked for you at camp. It's really quite amazing, some of the comments that I've seen. I guess one question that I had for you is, had you not gone into teaching, what do you think you would have done? Just out of curiosity.
It's a good question. I actually had 2 careers in mind. One was I wanted to become a fireman, but we all want to do crazy things, right? So I actually want to be a fireman because it would give me an opportunity to write, because I wanted to be a writer, write poetry, which I have written. Also, one point in my life, I was in pre-med at McGill, which made my parents very happy for a year, and then not so happy when I became an educator, but happier when I became the director of the White Country Camp, because they were able to join me there. But I think it was Bashert that I landed up in education, both formal education and informal education. And yeah, I think the journey turned out okay. Although, I'm a young 70, the journey's not over. I've got a long way to go yet, Morris. Don't shut me off just yet.
Did they support your move out of pre-med? Were they happy with you, or they were okay with that?
Yeah, they almost disowned me. They're Jewish parents.
But it worked out okay. And Zobin asked about, or mentioned the fact that you were on NCSY, and asked who the director was at the time you participated.
Who the director of NCSY was at the time?
Remember? I
have no idea. I know that I was actually, though, I lived in the Snowden area, and I was a member of, our family was a member of the Beth HaMidrash HaGadol, Rabbi Rosner Synagogue. So we were part of that group, but that's about it. I know we had some great rabbis who really supported the idea of non-religious Jewish kids participating in NCSY, which was a religious organization, and they were very open to us and really sort of like a pre-Chabad type of thing. They did in their own way what Chabad is doing so well these days.
Okay. Another question I wanted to ask you, I've spent time with you, I've spent time with your family, but you and Elaine have obviously taught a lot of kids. You've had a lot of children come through your camp and your schools. What's it like going to the Cavendish Mall? But it must be possible to walk through IGA without being constantly stopped.
Well, it's really interesting you say that. My kids hated it because people would stop us all the time, and our kids did not like it at all. So eventually we wound up going to Agrignon Shopping Center instead of the Cavendish Mall. But for me, especially now when I'm not out with my kids and I bump into somebody who was either at the camp or a student, as far as students go, most of them just talk about Elaine. Oh, she was the best math teacher in the world. And I said, what am I, chopped liver? They don't even think about me, but she happens to be the best math teacher in the world. It's really nice when people come up to me, parents, former students, former campers, and they'll smile and they'll say hello because it means that I did something right, and we had a good connection. Although I remember a few years ago, I bumped into a guy who was a former student of mine, and I said, "How old are you now?" And he said, "Well," and I said, "I'm 54." And then he thought for a minute. He said, "Oh my God, if I'm 54, how old are you?" Anyways, time flies when you're having fun, though.
No, but it's funny when you were talking about the march and when we were on the march together, and how your campers, you got such naches out of them being able to run a service. I remember, and I forgot to mention it until you said it, but I do remember that service Saturday morning was run exclusively by former campers of yours from YCC, which was incredible. Because 7 or 10 years later they had been young campers, and yet they completely ran the service. It was quite something.
Yeah, and I remember they would often, especially at the beginning, they would come up to me and ask me for ideas for the Parsha, for Dvar Torah, and where would I go? I would go online. And so
Right.
one day they said, "Where do you get this stuff? It's great." And I said, "Well, I get online." He says, "Well, why should we go to you? We could get it online ourselves." I said, "Good idea," which is what they did. And again, that's what you call nachas.
Absolutely. Stu, I'm sort of not seeing much more of the three. It sort of stopped. Are there any questions that you see that I'm not seeing? I'm sorry.
So someone just asked you what your favorite football team is, and bonus points if you guess who asks.
Well, my former assistant director at the White Country Camp, Stephen Rabinovich, who actually runs an incredible football program for little kids. If you have little grandchildren, he runs a great football program right now, especially during the pandemic. So important. Well, it used to be the Buffalo Bills because, Marv Levy was a coach in Montreal and he was Jewish and yada, yada, yada. So like everybody, I liked Buffalo.
Godfrey Rayner says he was surprised to find out tonight that you were Jewish.
Godfrey Rayner is an actor who happens to be in New York, who's my wife's first cousin.
Okay. Well,
we've also got a question of, do you know what happened to the Russian that you gave his name?
Right.
That's a great question. And I wish I could say, for some reason, I seem to recall that when we were in Israel, after being there for a month, I was there for almost a year, we went back to the Ministry of Absorption, and they did tell us that I had the guy's name. I don't remember his last name now, but I had written it down. And they did say that I think it was about almost a year after I had given his name, they actually were able to arrange for him to come to Israel. So thank you for that question. But we actually made it our point to try and find out.
That's amazing. So amazing. I think that's it, right, Stu? I don't see anything else in terms of questions.
I think
there's everybody congratulating you, Sid, on what a wonderful presentation. So thank you. And I guess at this point, we'll turn it over to Rabbi Whitman.
Okay, thank you very much. First, Mars, thank you very much for your work tonight moderating. Sid, this has really been incredible. You have given us a picture of what it was like for Holocaust survivors to come to Montreal and to start over, and what it was like to be part of those families. And I know there were many, many such people, and are many such families here in Montreal. But for those of us who did not grow up with that experience, it is invaluable to hear from you what that adjustment was like. It's just incredible to me to hear about your mother and the love for life she had and the appreciation for life she had after what she must have gone through. So that's so important for us to understand not only the Holocaust, but the aftermath, what the consequences, which are still with us in many ways. Your leadership over so many years is inspiring. And Sid, I want to be very open to say I have learned so much from you. First of all, those mosquitoes, they were aiming for me. So it was not accidental. They had my name and they were looking for me, and that was quite something. But you really taught me and gave me tremendous ideas about how to run those programs. There were other events at camp that you taught me. You are a mentor of mine because you have this unique way of incorporating Judaism into everything that you do and with everyone you come into contact with. And it just shows in so many ways. I personally have the great privilege to work together with you on more than half a dozen different programs. And I'm looking forward to all of them getting started again. You are one of the people that taught us about providing and programming for those with disabilities, and you give us the opportunity at ADAPT to participate in that. I am so grateful that with everything that you do and everything you've accomplished, that you are willing to do at least some of it with me, with Stu, with ADAPT, because we are enriched by it. So I want to wish you more and more years, at least 120, maybe more, working on behalf not only of the Jewish community, but on behalf of Judaism, spreading it formally, informally, to every kind of person that you come into contact with. And I look forward to working together with you. Thank you so much, Sid. You've done a great service tonight. All of us have benefited from this evening. Thank you very much.